The auctioneer's gavel was halfway down when I stepped through the back doors of Riverside Auction House. Margaret Wellington, the HOA president, who'd been making my life hell for 3 years, stood at the front podium with a victorious smirk plastered across her Botoxed face. She was literally seconds away from selling my 100-acre ranch, my grandfather's legacy, for unpaid HOA fees that I didn't even legally owe. Going once, going twice, the auctioneer called out, his voice echoing through the packed room filled with vultures ready to pick apart my property. That's when Margaret noticed me walking down the center aisle. Her triumphant expression melted into confusion, then horror, as recognition dawned on her perfectly made-up features. She knew that walk, that confident stride. But what she didn't know, what nobody in that room knew except me, was that I wasn't just there to watch my ranch get stolen. I owned the auction house. The same auction house she'd specifically chosen because she thought it would guarantee her victory. The same auction house where she'd bribed officials and manipulated the system to fast-track this illegal foreclosure. The irony was so perfect, so absolutely poetic, that I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing as I reached the front of the room. Margaret's face went 3 shades whiter than her overpriced silk blouse. The auctioneer's gavel hung frozen in midair as I placed my hand on his shoulder and whispered something in his ear. The entire room fell silent, sensing the shift in power dynamics they couldn't quite understand yet. But they were about to. Backstory: 3 years earlier, I'd inherited my grandfather's ranch on the outskirts of Pine Valley, a sprawling 100 acres of pristine wilderness, complete with a rustic cabin, stables, and enough land to raise cattle or horses. It was my sanctuary, my escape from the corporate world, where I'd made my fortune in real estate acquisitions and property management. The ranch sat on the very edge of the Pine Valley Estates, HOA jurisdiction, technically within their boundaries, but grandfathered in with agricultural exemptions that predated the HOA by 40 years. My grandfather had fought tooth and nail to keep those exemptions when the developers moved in, and he'd won every legal battle. I should have known that wouldn't be enough for Margaret Wellington. Margaret was the kind of HOA president who measured her self-worth by how many homeowners she could terrorize in a single day. She'd been running Pine Valley Estates like her personal kingdom for over a decade, wielding HOA regulations like weapons against anyone who dared to live differently than her vision of suburban perfection. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was feeding my horses when a pristine white BMW pulled up my dirt driveway, completely out of place against the rustic backdrop of my property. Out stepped Margaret in her designer heels, clutching a leather portfolio like it contained nuclear launch codes. "Mr. Davidson," she announced, not bothering with pleasantries, "I'm Margaret Wellington, president of Pine Valley Estates, HOA. We need to discuss your situation." She looked around my property with undisguised disgust, her nose wrinkling at the sight of my horses, the weathered barn, the authentic ranch lifestyle that I'd worked so hard to preserve. Everything about her screamed artificial, from her bottle blonde hair, to her fake nails, to her practiced smile that never reached her cold blue eyes. "What situation?" I asked, genuinely confused. Margaret opened her portfolio with theatrical precision and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "Your property is in violation of 17 different HOA covenants. Livestock on residential property, unapproved structures, failure to maintain landscaping standards, and..." She paused dramatically, "operating a commercial enterprise without permits." I almost laughed. "Commercial enterprise? Lady, I raise horses as a hobby. And my property has agricultural exemptions that..." "Had," she interrupted, her smile turning predatory. "Those exemptions expired 6 months ago. You failed to renew them, which means your property now falls under full HOA jurisdiction. You have 30 days to bring everything into compliance or face penalties." That's when I knew this wasn't about regulations or compliance. This was personal. Margaret had done her homework, found a technicality, and was preparing to exploit it. But what she didn't know was that she just declared war on someone who owned half the commercial real estate in 3 counties. I'd built my fortune by being smarter, more prepared, and more ruthless than my opponents. Margaret Wellington was about to learn why you never corner a predator in his own territory. Escalation. The violations started small, almost petty. Margaret would drive by my property twice a day, photographing everything from the angle of my fence posts to the height of my grass. She measured shadows, counted animals, and documented every single detail that could possibly be construed as an HOA violation. Within a week, I received my first official citation: failure to maintain approved ground cover in front yard area. My crime? Allowing wildflowers to grow naturally in a meadow that had looked the same way for 60 years. The fine was $500. I ignored it. 2 weeks later, another citation arrived: unapproved structure on residential property. She was referring to my grandfather's 100-year-old grain silo, a historical landmark that had been grandfathered in before the HOA even existed. Another $500 fine. Margaret was just getting started. The third citation came with photos, dozens of them, showing my horses creating noise disturbances during quiet hours. Apparently, horses eating grass at 7 a.m. violated the neighborhood's peace and tranquility. This time, the fine was $1,000, and it came with a threat: continued violations will result in enforcement action. I called my lawyer, David Chen, a property rights specialist who'd helped me navigate dozens of complex real estate deals. His advice was frustratingly predictable: pay the fines, file for renewed agricultural exemptions, and hope she gets bored and moves on to someone else. But David didn't understand Margaret Wellington like I was beginning to. This wasn't about money or compliance. This was about power, control, and the sick satisfaction she got from destroying people's lives. The fourth citation proved my point. It arrived on a Friday afternoon, hand-delivered by Margaret herself. She stood on my front porch in her designer suit, practically vibrating with excitement as she handed me the envelope. "Mr. Davidson, I do hope you're prepared to make some changes around here." Inside the envelope was a citation for operating an illegal animal rescue without proper permits. Margaret had somehow discovered that I occasionally helped rehabilitate injured wild horses, nursing them back to health before releasing them back to their herds. It was something my grandfather had done for decades, something the local wildlife authorities not only approved of, but actively encouraged. But Margaret had twisted it into evidence of a commercial operation. The fine was $5,000, and the citation came with an ultimatum: remove all animals from the property within 72 hours or face immediate legal action. That's when I realized Margaret wasn't just trying to fine me into submission. She was trying to destroy everything my grandfather had built, everything that made this place special. She wanted to turn my ranch into another cookie-cutter suburban lot with perfectly manicured grass and houses that all looked exactly the same. I looked at Margaret standing on my porch, her fake smile not quite hiding the vicious satisfaction in her eyes. She thought she was winning. She thought she'd found my breaking point. She had no idea that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. Turning point. That night, I sat in my grandfather's old leather chair, surrounded by decades of HOA correspondence, legal documents, and property records. Margaret had been methodical in her attack, but she'd also been sloppy. In her eagerness to destroy me, she'd left a paper trail of her own corruption. I discovered that Margaret had been using her HOA presidency to systematically target properties she wanted for herself or her friends. 3 families had been driven out of the neighborhood in the past 2 years through similar harassment campaigns. Their properties had been sold at below-market prices to developers who just happened to be Margaret's business partners. But the most interesting discovery came buried in a stack of municipal records. Margaret had been lobbying the county to change zoning laws, specifically targeting agricultural exemptions. She wanted to eliminate them entirely, opening up ranch properties like mine for residential development. That's when her endgame became crystal clear. Margaret wasn't just trying to destroy my ranch out of spite. She was trying to steal it. I spent the next 3 days making phone calls, following paper trails, and connecting dots that painted a picture of corruption so vast it made my head spin. Margaret had turned the HOA into her personal criminal enterprise, using regulations as weapons to acquire property through legal extortion. But she'd made one critical error in her research. While she'd discovered that my agricultural exemptions had expired, she'd never bothered to investigate who I really was or what resources I had at my disposal. Margaret saw me as just another homeowner she could bully into submission. She had no idea that I owned Commercial Properties Management, one of the largest property acquisition companies in the state. She didn't know that I controlled dozens of businesses, employed hundreds of people, and had connections throughout the legal and political systems. Most importantly, she had no idea that 6 months earlier, I'd quietly acquired Riverside Auction House, the same auction house the county used for all foreclosure sales. It was time to show Margaret Wellington what real power looked like. I called David Chen back, but this time I wasn't asking for defensive legal advice. David, I need you to do something for me. I need you to let me lose. Excuse me? Margaret Wellington thinks she's going to foreclose on my ranch through unpaid HOA fees. I want you to let her win. Don't fight the lions. Don't challenge the violations. Let her get all the way to the auction. David was quiet for a long moment. Jake, are you having some kind of breakdown? Because if she gets to auction, you'll lose everything. I smiled, thinking about the look on Margaret's face when she realized what I'd done. No, David. I'm going to let her think she's won, and then I'm going to destroy her. The next morning, I called Margaret Wellington directly. She answered on the first ring, probably hoping I was calling to surrender. Margaret, this is Jake Davidson. You win. I can't fight the fines anymore. I'll be moving the horses off the property this weekend. I could practically hear her salivating through the phone. Mr. Davidson, I'm so glad you've come to your senses. However, the accumulated fines and penalties now total $47,000, and that amount must be paid in full, or the property will be subject to foreclosure proceedings. I understand, I said, injecting just the right amount of defeat into my voice. I don't have that kind of money. I guess you'll have to take the ranch. Margaret's laugh was pure predatory satisfaction. Mr. Davidson, the foreclosure auction is scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. at Riverside Auction House. I do hope you'll find somewhere else to keep your animals. After she hung up, I sat back in my grandfather's chair and smiled. Margaret Wellington had just handed me the rope I needed to hang her with. Revenge payoff. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in letting my opponent think she was winning. I played the role of defeated rancher perfectly, going through the motions of preparing to lose everything while secretly orchestrating the most satisfying revenge of my career. Margaret couldn't contain her excitement. She drove by my property daily, sometimes bringing friends to gloat over her impending victory. I watched through my windows as she pointed at my land, already planning how she'd divide it up for development. What Margaret didn't know was that I'd spent those 3 weeks gathering evidence of her corruption, financial records showing how she'd profited from previous foreclosures, communications with developers who'd bought targeted properties at below-market prices, audio recordings of her bragging about manipulating HOA regulations to acquire land. I also discovered something even more damaging. Margaret had been embezzling from the HOA for years. She'd been inflating fine amounts, charging fake legal fees, and pocketing the difference. The property owners she'd terrorized had been unknowingly funding her lavish lifestyle. But the best part was watching her prepare for the auction. Margaret spent thousands of dollars on legal fees, hired a property management company to handle the transition, and even had business cards printed for Wellington Development Partners, the company she planned to use to flip my ranch. She told everyone who would listen about her brilliant victory over the stubborn rancher who dared to defy her authority. Margaret Wellington was about to become a legend in her own mind. 2 days before the auction, I made my final preparation. I called Tom Harrison, the head auctioneer at Riverside Auction House, and gave him specific instructions. Tom, tomorrow's foreclosure auction needs to proceed exactly as scheduled. Don't acknowledge that I own the company. Let Mrs. Wellington have her moment. But when I walk through those doors, you'll know what to do. Tom had worked for me for 2 years and understood my business philosophy. Sometimes the best victories require patience. Jake, are you sure about this? Because once that auction starts, things could get complicated fast. Trust me, Tom. Everything that's about to happen is completely legal. Margaret Wellington is about to learn what it feels like to have her life destroyed by someone with actual power. The morning of the auction, I watched from my ranch as Margaret's BMW pulled up to my property one last time. She got out with a photographer, documenting her final victory for what I assumed would be social media posts about her triumph over the difficult homeowner. Margaret stood on my front porch, the same porch where my grandfather had taught me to ride horses, where 3 generations of my family had watched sunsets over the valley and posed for pictures like a conquering general. She had no idea that she was standing on the threshold of her own destruction. I let her have that moment. Because in 2 hours, Margaret Wellington's world was going to implode in the most spectacular way possible. At 9:45 a.m., I parked my truck 3 blocks away from Riverside Auction House and walked toward the building where my family's legacy was supposedly about to be sold to the highest bidder. The irony was so perfect, it felt like divine intervention. Through the windows, I could see Margaret holding court in the front row, surrounded by her developer friends and fellow HOA board members. She was wearing a red power suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her smile was so bright it could have powered the entire building. The auction room was packed with Vulture's investors who specialized in picking apart foreclosed properties, developers looking for cheap land, and curiosity seekers who enjoyed watching other people's misfortune. Margaret had invited half the neighborhood to witness her triumph. At exactly 10 a.m., Tom Harrison stepped up to the podium and began the proceedings. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's foreclosure auction. We have one property on the schedule, the Davidson Ranch, a 100-acre property with residential structures, listed for unpaid HOA fees totaling $47,000. Margaret practically bounced in her seat with excitement. Do I hear an opening bid of $50,000? 3 hands shot up immediately. Margaret's smile faltered slightly as she realized she'd have competition, but she quickly regained her composure. She'd come prepared to spend whatever it took. The bidding started fast and heated up quickly. Margaret bid aggressively, driving the price up past $100,000, then $150,000, then $200,000. Her developer friends tried to keep up, but Margaret had clearly decided this was personal. She wanted my ranch, and she was willing to pay premium prices to get it. By the time the bidding reached $250,000, only Margaret and one other bidder remained. She was getting visibly frustrated, her perfect composure cracking as the anonymous bidder on the phone kept matching her offers. $275,000. Margaret called out, her voice sharp with irritation. $300,000 from the phone, Tom announced. $325,000. Margaret was practically shouting now, her face flushed with anger and excitement. $350,000 from the phone. That's when I decided it was time to make my entrance. Margaret was so focused on her bidding war that she didn't notice me walking through the back doors. But Tom saw me immediately and gave an almost imperceptible nod. I made my way down the center aisle slowly, letting the moment build. A few people recognized me. I was known in local real estate circles, but most of the crowd was focused on the escalating auction drama. Margaret was still bidding, now up to $375,000, for a ranch that was probably worth $400,000 at market value. She was paying top dollar for the privilege of stealing my family's land, and the beautiful irony of it made me smile. $400,000. Margaret declared triumphantly, confident that she'd finally scared off her competition. That's when Tom made the announcement that would change everything. Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue, I need to make a disclosure. The owner of Riverside Auction House has just arrived and wishes to address the proceedings. The room fell silent. Margaret's head snapped toward the podium, confusion replacing her victorious expression. She'd specifically chosen this auction house because she thought it would guarantee her victory. The idea that the owner might intervene had never occurred to her. I'd like to introduce Jake Davidson, owner of Riverside Auction House and Commercial Properties Management. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Margaret's face went white as she finally spotted me standing in the aisle, no longer the defeated rancher she'd been terrorizing for months. The power dynamic had shifted so dramatically that even the vultures in the audience could feel it. "Mr. Davidson," Tom continued, "would you like to address the auction of your own property?" I walked to the front of the room, past Margaret, who was sitting frozen in her chair, past her developer friends, who were starting to realize they'd been played, past all the people who'd come to watch my downfall. "Thank you, Tom," I said, taking the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your interest in my family's ranch. However, before we finalize this sale, I think everyone deserves to know the truth about how this auction came to be." Margaret tried to stand up, probably to object or escape, but her legs seemed to have stopped working. She slumped back into her chair, trapped by her own arrogance and the crowd of witnesses she'd invited to celebrate her victory. "This foreclosure," I continued, "is based on HOA fees that were illegally imposed by a corrupt HOA president who has been systematically targeting properties for personal gain. I have evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy that I'll be turning over to the district attorney's office this afternoon." The room buzzed with excitement. This was better than any reality TV show, and they all had front row seats. "Furthermore," I said, looking directly at Margaret as the owner of this auction house, "I'm declaring this foreclosure invalid due to procedural irregularities and evidence of corruption. This auction is hereby canceled." Margaret finally found her voice. "You can't do that," she shrieked, her composure completely shattered. "This is legal." I followed all the procedures. "You owe those fees." I smiled at her, the same predatory smile she'd been giving me for months. "Margaret, you're absolutely right that you followed procedures. Unfortunately, you followed procedures that you knew were fraudulent. You imposed fees that you knew were illegal. And you used your position to steal property that was never legally subject to HOA jurisdiction in the first place." I pulled out a folder thick with documents and evidence. "I have recordings of you admitting that you knew my agricultural exemptions were still valid. I have financial records showing how you've embezzled from the HOA. I have communications with developers who've been buying properties you've targeted. And I have testimony from 3 other families you've driven out of their homes through similar schemes." Margaret's face was cycling through shades of white and red as the full scope of her situation became clear. She'd invited dozens of witnesses to what she thought would be her greatest triumph. Instead, she'd provided an audience for her complete destruction. "The $47,000 you claim I owe in fines?" I continued. "That money was illegally collected and will be returned to its rightful owners, the homeowners you've been extorting for years. The lines you placed on my property were fraudulent and will be removed immediately." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Margaret was trembling now, probably running through all the ways her life was about to be destroyed. "But here's the best part, Margaret. Since you've spent the last hour bidding on property that was never legally available for auction, and since you've done so in front of dozens of witnesses, you've essentially confessed to conspiracy and attempted fraud. The district attorney is going to love this." The crowd was eating it up. Some people were recording on their phones, others were whispering excitedly to their neighbors. Margaret's humiliation was being documented and would probably be all over social media within hours. Margaret finally managed to stand up, her legs shaky and her voice cracking. This is revenge. You can't prove any of this." I opened my folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Actually, Margaret, I can prove all of it. Starting with this recording of you talking to your developer friend last week about how you were going to finally get that stubborn rancher off his land so we can build condos." I pressed play on my phone, and Margaret's voice filled the auction room. "Jake Davidson has no idea what he's up against. By Friday, I'll own his ranch, and by Christmas, we'll have ground broken on the Wellington Estates development. He should have just paid the fines and moved his horses somewhere else." The recording continued for another 30 seconds, with Margaret bragging about manipulating HOA regulations and planning to profit from my property. When it ended, the room was dead silent except for the sound of Margaret's labored breathing. "That recording," I announced, "along with dozens of others, financial records, and witness testimony, will be delivered to District Attorney Patricia Morrison this afternoon. Margaret, you might want to call your lawyer." Margaret looked around the room desperately, probably hoping for support from her friends and allies. Instead, she found a room full of people documenting her downfall and distancing themselves from her as quickly as possible. Her developer friends were already heading for the exits. Her fellow HOA board members were studiously avoiding eye contact. Even the auctioneer staff was treating her like she had a contagious disease. Margaret Wellington, the woman who'd spent years terrorizing homeowners and wielding power like a weapon, was completely alone and utterly defeated. But I wasn't done yet. Aftermath and epilogue. The aftermath of Margaret's public humiliation unfolded faster than I could have imagined. Within 24 hours, the story had spread throughout Pine Valley and beyond. Local news stations picked up the story of the corrupt HOA president who'd tried to steal a ranch and ended up confessing to fraud in front of dozens of witnesses. Margaret Wellington became a cautionary tale, a social media meme, and the subject of a criminal investigation all at the same time. The district attorney's office moved quickly once they saw the evidence I'd compiled. Margaret was arrested 3 days after the auction on charges of embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of office. The HOA's financial records revealed that she'd stolen over $200,000 from homeowners over a 5-year period. Her development partners were also charged as co-conspirators. The 3 properties she'd helped them acquire through fraudulent foreclosures were returned to their original owners, along with substantial compensation for their suffering. The Pine Valley Estates HOA was dissolved and restructured under state oversight. New elections were held, new bylaws were written, and a strict code of ethics was implemented to prevent future corruption. As for my ranch, all the fraudulent lines were removed, and my agricultural exemptions were not only renewed but permanently protected under a new county ordinance. I even received a formal apology from the county commissioners, who were embarrassed that Margaret's corruption had gone undetected for so long. But the sweetest revenge came 6 months later, when Margaret's own house went up for foreclosure. Turns out, she'd been living far beyond her means, funding her lavish lifestyle with stolen HOA money. When that income stream dried up, she couldn't make her mortgage payments. Guess which auction house handled her foreclosure sale? I didn't bid on Margaret's house, that would have been petty. But I did attend the auction, sitting in the back row and watching as her dream home sold for less than she owed on it. The woman who'd tried to destroy my family's legacy ended up losing everything she'd worked to build. Margaret served 18 months in minimum security prison and was ordered to pay full restitution to her victims. She moved out of state after her release, presumably to start over somewhere her reputation hadn't preceded her. Sometimes late at night, when I'm sitting on my grandfather's porch, watching the sunset over my 100 acres of protected land, I think about that morning at Riverside Auction House. The moment when Margaret realized that her victim had become her judge, jury, and executioner. There's a lesson in there somewhere about the dangers of absolute power, about karma, about the importance of knowing your enemy before you declare war on them. But mostly, it's just a deeply satisfying story about justice, served with a side of poetic irony. She had no idea she was going to war with someone who owned the battlefield.